Okay, so what is philosophy? That's kind of the typical question that one asks whenever you take a course in anything, right? What is psychology? What is biology? What is chemistry? So that's sort of like the groundwork we have to lay before we jump into the course. And I think in philosophy, this question is particularly difficult to answer. When we ask the question, what is philosophy, all sorts of answers present themselves to us, varied answers, different answers, disparate answers. And once we really get into the course material, once we start reading some of the different philosophers, you'll see they're not going to always agree on what philosophy is, okay? So I don't really want to give you a general definition today of philosophy. I guess if you really, really, really want one, you can look at the course catalog. It says something like, examines fundamental questions concerning existence and God, and etc. Sure, that's all fine and dandy. But I think we'll learn better by actually looking at some philosophers, seeing how they do what they do, and then we can get our own idea of what we think philosophy really is. I mean, the word philosophy, it comes from the Greek, right? Philo is love, right? And sophis is wisdom, or sometimes knowledge is how it's understood. So a philosopher, I guess, literally is a lover of wisdom, right? But don't scientists love wisdom? Or at least maybe like scientific wisdom or knowledge, right? So that doesn't really explain much. But that's the etymology. That's where the word comes from, the Greek, right? Love of wisdom. And I'll start by not telling you really what philosophy is, but rather what it isn't, okay? I think that the word philosophy oftentimes, when we use it in our everyday speech, in our colloquial speech, it can oftentimes be replaced with the word opinion without really losing the meaning, right? If somebody says, hey, it's just my philosophy, what are they saying? Oh, it's just my opinion. It's just what I believe, right? So I remember when I became a philosophy major and I told people this, sometimes they would say, so what, you just BS all the time? You just write papers and just BS, just, oh, my opinion, this is what I think. Geez, if that's what it was, it'd probably be the easiest major on the planet, right? Just write what I think, right? I've had students do that. They write a term paper and they'll give me their opinion, and they get a horrible grade, and they're like, well, why did I get such a bad score? It's just my philosophy, just my opinion, right? No, right? It's a little bit more rigorous than that, right? It's a little bit more subtle, and it's a lot more complex, I think, than just figuring out what people's opinions are or having an opinion. We all have our opinions. In philosophy, we want to try to find a way to support our opinions or support our beliefs, or however you want to put it. We have to have a good argument, right? And so we're going to talk about arguments later in the lecture here, right? This is another word I think that gets misused quite a bit, is argument. We have a very specific meaning for it when we say argument in philosophy. But before we do that, before we go over to arguments, let's talk about some of the branches of philosophy. Some say that there are 4 major branches. So you can take philosophy in general and kind of divide it up into 4 parts. There's other ways of doing it, but this is one. Certainly, much of philosophy, particularly in the ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy, the focus was on metaphysics. You can spell that right, but yeah, metaphysics. Besides that, we also have what's called epistemology. Maybe some of you have heard the word metaphysics, but it's pretty rare to hear this word, so I'm surprised if anybody knows what that is. Ethics, something much more common. I hope somebody in here has an idea of what ethics is. And last but not least, logic. Now, sometimes logic gets included under metaphysics, but other logicians, they want it to be its own separate category, right? It deserves its own branch, I suppose, right? But what about metaphysics? What do we do when we're doing metaphysics? What kind of questions are we trying to answer when we're doing metaphysics? Well, is anyone at all familiar with the term metaphysics? You think maybe have an idea what it might mean? No? If you go to the bookstore a lot, like I do, right? Especially if you go to the philosophy section, you might pass through another section that's usually right next to it, right? Usually you've got philosophy and then all the Bibles and the religious books kind of close together. And occasionally they'll even have a little tiny section called metaphysical studies, okay? And if you ever go to a bookstore and you look in those sections, you're not going to find academic metaphysics. You're not going to find the kind of metaphysics that I'm talking about. What are you going to find? Nobody knows. Nobody goes to bookstores anymore. We got Kindles. We go online and do that. We talk, what's a bookstore, right? Metaphysical studies, you're going to find tarot cards, maybe crystals and stuff. Like, oh, it's an aura crystal. I can read your aura with this crystal, right? ESP, books on ESP. Do you know what ESP is? Extrasensory perception. How to read people's minds, right? Or books about ghosts and stuff, or books about dream interpretation, things like that, right? So kind of like occultish kind of stuff, right? Magic spells and things like this. That's not what Plato was doing, okay? That's not what Aristotle was doing when he was asking metaphysical questions. For us, metaphysics examines the underlying nature of reality. Right? What is real? What is there in the universe, right? What is the nature of the universe? Right? The underlying nature of reality. It tries to explain the reality that we're in, the universe that we're in, right? Why is the universe here? Right? As Leibniz would ask, why is there something rather than nothing? You know? Why is it that things are here? And what is here, you might ask, right? What exists and what doesn't exist, right? Does God exist? That's a metaphysical question, right? If there is a God, that would definitely have something to do with reality, right? That would be a significant thing to know if I'm a metaphysician, right? So again, questions about the underlying nature of reality. Epistemology, nobody knows what that means. Anybody? No? Okay. So I'm asking questions pertaining to knowledge. I might ask, what is knowledge? Right? How do I define that word? Is it the same thing as belief? Right? If you say you believe something, is that the same thing as saying you know it? Most epistemologists say no, but they've got to distinguish between those. You know, what does it mean to know? What does it mean to believe? What's the difference? Right? That would be an epistemological question, dealing with knowledge claims. How do I justify knowledge? That'd be a good question for epistemology, right? How am I ever justified in saying that I do know something, right? If we believe the skeptic, then we might be in some trouble here. What is skepticism? Anybody? What does it mean if I'm skeptical about something? Not sure, I doubt it, right? I could take skepticism pretty far, couldn't I? I mean, how do I know that I'm even standing here and telling you about philosophy? Maybe this is all a dream or an illusion, right? Someone Descartes might ask or say, right? So the epistemologist might have to deal with that skeptical dilemma, right? How do I know I can even know anything, right? Those are all issues in epistemology. Well, ethics, I hope somebody can tell me what ethics deals with. What do you think you're going to do in ethics if you take a class in ethics here?
What is right and wrong?
Right and wrong, morality, right? In fact, the word morality or morals pretty much means the same thing as ethics, right? So it has to do with action, right? What should I do, right? And why should I do it? Determining the rightness and the wrongness of actions. These are all ethical questions. And sometimes in academia, they don't like to give ethics its own category. They want to subsume it under a much broader category, value theory. I suppose there are values besides just ethical values. I guess artistic values, things like this, right? So I guess value theory, that term would have much broader connotations than ethics, because ethics just focuses, again, on right and wrong, good and bad, morality, right? Now, what about logic, right? We're not going to be doing a lot of logic in here, at least formal logic, but you can take a class in logic here at Lone Star College, symbolic logic. What trying to determine what is a good argument and what is a bad argument. In other words, we're trying to figure out what good reasoning is and what is bad reasoning. Right? A lot of times a logician, what they'll do is they try to come up with good rules. They call them rules of inference. Right? Basically, what can I infer given the truth of certain statements? It's like when you're doing mathematics. Have you ever done a proof in mathematics where you have like a certain group of statements and you're supposed to somehow prove another statement? That's what you do in logic, right? Given the truth of these, what can I infer from it? Okay, and we'll come back to this a little bit today, right? I'm not going to torture you with logic that much during the semester. It'll kind of be there under the surface the whole time. But today, we're just going to look at some very simple ways of determining whether we have a good argument or whether we have a bad argument. But before we do that, let's sort of put that on the back burner for just a moment. Let's think of some other ways that I might take philosophy in general and just kind of cut it up and dissect it, right? We put it in these four branches, right? Metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, logic. You might also think of philosophy in terms of historical periods. And that's kind of a good way to think it in this course because I tend to teach it historically, right? We're going to start with Socrates and Plato back in ancient Greece, and then slowly we'll move our way up to the 20th century, right, till we get to the existentialists, things like that. So the way that philosophy looks at history is slightly different than other courses, right? If you take a class in, let's say, art appreciation, or in the humanities. The way they divide up these different historical periods often differs, right? So in philosophy, it usually is regarded as beginning in, Western philosophy, at least, put that word up here, Western philosophy. Western philosophy is thought to have pretty much originated with Socrates. There's a few figures before him, but it pretty much goes with Socrates, Plato, and all. They're the ones that brought it to fruition. This period is known as the ancient, sometimes the classical period in philosophy. Right? After that, we get the medieval period. We will be covering this in brief. We're not going to go over it very much in detail. A lot of times, the medieval gets squished together with the Renaissance. Can I spell Renaissance? I think I can. I think that's right. Why would you squeeze these two together? I mean, if you take a class in art history, geez, you're going to spend like half the semester on the Renaissance. A lot of important things went on during the Renaissance period. This isn't quite the case for philosophy. In fact, a lot of people think the medieval and the Renaissance period were kind of stagnant. There wasn't a lot going on. And what was going on was typically religious. It was mostly theology. Right? What's theology? Anybody? Theology has to do with religion. Study of what's theos? Anybody know their Latin? Theos? God. Right. So figuring out God. Theology is coming with a theory to explain God, God's nature, does God exist, these sort of things. So we get a lot of theology in the medieval and the Renaissance period, right? And we can see why historically, right? The church was a very important element during this period. Right? They were probably one of the most stable institutions in Western Europe during this period. And most of the science and any sort of scholarly activity was done in the church. Right? You didn't have independent secular scientists. All the scientists were priests, for the most part. Right? I think sometimes this period gets a little neglected. I think that they sell it short a bit. But I kind of guess I'm selling it short because we're barely covering it in this class. But we've got so much to do. So, after the Renaissance, though, and here's where it gets kind of weird with the names, we call this the modern period in philosophy, okay? And Descartes is often referred to as the father of modern philosophy. Descartes dies in 1650, okay? So that's why I think it might be kind of odd to call this the modern period, right? If you've taken a class in humanities or art appreciation, the word modern is not applied to art until when? When about? Anybody know? What would you modern, maybe. That's late 1800s, right? But no, for us, the modern period begins after the Renaissance. This will often be referred to, if you take another class, as the Age of Enlightenment, right? But there's a lot going on in philosophy, right? Whereas this is seen as stagnant, this is kind of a new Renaissance, the scientific revolution just happens, so all these philosophers have a different perspective on the world, and things change quite a bit, right? After this, we get sort of lazy, and we just either talk about it by century, or sometimes, it'll be 19th century philosophy, 20th century philosophy. Of course, we just began the 21st, so we can't really say much about it yet. But sometimes you'll hear people talk about the 19th century as the late modern period. So again, we've got philosophy broken down by branch, right, the 4 branches. We've got it broken down by historical periods, right? We can also break it down by schools of thought, right? Different philosophers, different figures have different ways of thinking, different schools of thought. Plato is such an important philosopher. He gets his own school, right? We have Platonism. During the medieval period, you even get, this is really how influential he is, Neoplatonism, which is basically Christianity plus Plato. Thank Augustine for that. During the modern period, we'll get into more details when we get to that point, but you've got the empiricists, right? Empiricism. And the competing view is rationalism. Don't worry about what those mean. I'm just sort of giving you examples here, right? And 20th century, you got things like existentialism. You may be familiar with that term. Right? And so you've got different schools of thought. Another way that we might break up philosophy is just simply by subject matter. I know, at UH, if you look at their catalog, in their philosophy department, they're very historically minded. They have a big, strong history of philosophy, a contingent there. So you see a lot of 19th century philosophy classes, they go century by century, all the way back to the 16th century. But you also might look at other programs and see all sorts of crazy classes, like philosophy of science, right? Or even more specific, philosophy of biology, right? They get real specific. Philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of... I took a graduate course in philosophy of social sciences. So we looked at psychology and sociology and anthropology and all of these sciences that are trying to analyze human behavior. And we did philosophy on that, criticizing it, seeing what works, what doesn't. But again, it gets real specific, You take a class in ethics here, but if you go to a larger university, you might see classes in environmental ethics, right? Or business ethics, or medical ethics. In fact, have a lot of friends that are making pretty good money being medical ethicists, right? So who says philosophy doesn't pay? But at UNT, University of North Texas, they have a class in the philosophy of food. So I'm not really sure what they do or talk about. Maybe you talk about the aesthetics, what is the proper way to, or maybe moral issues, like, is it moral to eat veal or something? Or what is that stuff, foie gras? You know what that is, the goose liver pate that they banned in, like, Wyoming or something. Anybody hear about this? Where did they ban it? I forgot what state, but they banned it. You cannot buy foie gras in that state because it's too cruel. What do they do to these poor geese? Just like veal, they put them in this container where they can't move, and they put this little, this feeder right in front of their face their whole life. So basically, they're just eating milk all day, just fattening them up, right? It makes their liver really big and fatty, and taste really good. Apparently, at least that's what the French say. But it's cruel, so they say no, you can't do it. Right? We have to outlaw foie gras in Wyoming or wherever the heck it was. That might be something they talk about in philosophy of food, but I'm sort of at a loss. But again, you see that pretty much for every subject matter, there's probably somewhere a course that deals with the philosophy of that subject matter. Okay. Well, earlier I was making a point that it's Western philosophy that we're talking about here. what do I mean by that, do you think? Why Western as opposed to Eastern? West of where? Right. So Eastern philosophy would be probably like, philosophy originating in Asia or, maybe parts of Eurasia. But this is an interesting debacle because if we think about it, if we think about history, right, and we think about not just philosophy but religion, I took a course in Western religions as an undergraduate, and when I was studying Western religions, which religions do you think I was studying? What religions are popular in the West as opposed to the East, right? The East, you got Buddhism and Hindu and, some more obscure like Jainism and stuff. But Western religions, what? Christianity? Judaism. And they included Islam. They included Islam as a Western religion. But where did these start? In the West? Most of them started right there at the end of the Mediterranean, right? The end of the Mediterranean around Israel and that area, right? And Saudi Arabia today and all that. Would you call that the West? No, not at all. But these belief systems, these faiths, have had a much greater impact on the Western hemisphere, I suppose, than they have had on the Eastern hemisphere. So although we say Western philosophy, it might be kind of messy. It's not literally West, but yeah, the Western way of thinking, sort of the Western. And there's some pretty stark contrast between the philosophical approach of the East and the philosophical approach of the West, right? We'll see that as we get through the course. I'll be using a few examples here and there of some Eastern beliefs and sort of to contrast with the West. There's a couple figures, I think. Heraclitus is one we'll talk about on Wednesday, and Nietzsche maybe, who are kind of exceptions, right? Who have, I guess, elements of that Eastern flair. But it's going to be a pretty Western class here, right? So I hope that doesn't intimidate or tick some people off, right? I know there's like a lot of anti-Western sentiment in that area of the world, right, where Western religions originated, right? Well, I said I was going to talk about arguments, okay? So I think we're ready for that, and this is pretty much, we're almost done, right? Well, once we get through arguments, I think we'll be ready to go. This word argument, just like the word philosophy, I think this gets misused quite a bit, or at least it's used differently in colloquial speech, right? When I talk about an argument, I'm talking to a buddy or something. Let's say my friend comes over to visit and says, I just got in an argument with my girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever. Sometimes that's not technically the case, at least by our definition of argument, right? Imagine the scenario, we've got the girl, you don't love me, you don't care about me. Yeah, I do, sweetie, I love you. No, you don't, you hate me. No, I love you. Okay, this is not an argument. This is really just a disagreement, right? An argument, at least for us, is going to involve at least one premise, okay? Hopefully more than one premise. It's going to be a good argument. So maybe some premises. And these premises, right, these statements that are supposed to be taken as fact, are used to establish a conclusion. Okay? So argument always has at least one premise, and the premise is supposed to establish the truth of some conclusion. So maybe let's go back to the example. You don't love me, you don't care about me. Oh yeah, I do, sweetie. Remember, I remembered your birthday, and I took you out on our anniversary. I bought you flowers last week. Remember, I cooked you dinner last month. Therefore, I love you. Maybe this is a crappy argument. Maybe the guy's lying through his teeth. But it's an argument nonetheless. He's giving us some premises, right? I remembered your birthday, I took you out, etc., etc. Therefore, we can conclude that I love you, right? So here we have an argument. For our purposes, it gets a lot more complicated than this, but all we really need to know is that in order for an argument to be a good argument, two things have to be true. One, it has to be valid, okay? It has to be a valid argument. So we've got to talk about what that means. What is validity? The second thing is it has to be sound. So what is soundness? Okay, well, let's go ahead. I'll put a couple arguments up on the board, and then we'll look and we'll check for validity and soundness, and then we'll get a better idea of exactly what these terms mean. But maybe I'll kind of just give you this preliminary definition of validity. what does it mean for an argument to be valid? Well, basically what that means is that there's a logical connection between what's said in the premises and what is asserted in the conclusion, right? There's a logical connection such that the conclusion actually follows from what's been said in the premises. That is, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true, right? If it's a valid argument, there's a logical connection between the premises and the conclusion, such that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Okay, so let's get an argument up here on the board so we kind of see what one looks like, and then we'll try to figure out what it means to be valid, right? And whether or not this is a valid argument. Well, let's try this one on for size. Let's say I have an argument with two premises, and the first premise says something like this. The Earth is roughly spherical. So the Earth is shaped roughly like a sphere. And the second premise, ice cream is a popular dessert. Therefore, we can conclude that, that's what that symbol means, the moon is made of green cheese. Okay, now, believe it or not, this is an argument. Now, I'm not saying it's a good argument, but it's an argument nonetheless. We have two premises, right, which we need to have an argument, and we're supposed to get a conclusion. We're supposed to be able to draw this conclusion from what's said in the premises. But we might ask ourselves first, is it valid? Is it a valid argument? That is, if the premises are true, does the conclusion have to be true? That is there a logical connection between the premises and the conclusion? Who thinks there is? Is it valid? I don't think so. Why not, though? Why is it not valid? What's wrong with it? Yes, in the back. Right, yeah, right. These statements here are not saying anything about the moon. There's really no relation between these statements, right? I mean, the shape of the Earth, the popularity of ice cream, this has nothing to do with what the moon is made out of, right? I mean, at least last time I took science class, that's what it was like. You know, maybe there's some wacky scientist who's published a ice cream popularity dissertation on, moon composition or something. I don't know. But yeah, as far as I know, you're right. Yeah, there's no connection. This is not valid. So let's try a different argument. Let's try this. I'll be lazy here. Reuse some stuff. Let's say this. First premise. If ice cream is a popular dessert, then the moon is made of green cheese. Excuse me. Second premise, ice cream is a popular dessert. Therefore, we can conclude that the moon is made of green cheese. I really want to get that conclusion. I don't know if I can get it, though. Let's see here. So we want to ask first, we haven't got to soundness yet, but we know what validity is. So is this valid, right? Think about it this way, right? Forget about whether 1 and 2 are true. Let's just assume they are, right? If they were true, would this have to be true as well? In other words, is this a valid argument? Who thinks it's valid? Quite a few of you. Okay, who doesn't think it's valid? It actually is valid. It is a valid argument, as wacky as it sounds. And maybe it's hard to see this, but what we do in logic a lot is we symbolize these arguments with letters and variables to kind of simplify them and just to get a good idea of what the form of the argument is. So what we'll do is we'll take, like the first premise, let's say, and it's a compound sentence, so it's got a couple elements, and we need to use our variable. Let's say we'll take the first part, ice cream was a popular dessert, and we'll just call it A. That'll be our variable for the first part of the sentence. And then the second part where it says the moon is made of green cheese, B. That'll be represented by B. So if I want to represent this argument in symbolic language, let's say I just I've got if, then second premise and third premise. I've already got all the variables that I need to represent this argument, right? What goes in the blanks here? If what, then what? A, B, what? If A, then B, right? Pretty obvious, right? If A, then B. What is the second premise basically saying? A, right? And the conclusion? Right, B. So any argument that has this form is always a valid argument, right? It doesn't matter what A or B stands for, right? If there's monkeys on the moon, they're going to eat some bananas up there. There are monkeys on the moon, we better get them some bananas, right? Doesn't matter what A and B stands for, these are always going to be valid arguments, right? If it's raining outside, the ground will be wet. If it's raining outside, the ground will be wet. These sort of things, right? So again, the variables are irrelevant. Any argument of that form is going to be a valid argument. But now we move on to soundness, right? We've got validity, but what does it mean to be sound? Well, I haven't told you yet. A couple things have to be true. One, if an argument is sound, one, it has to be valid. Okay, so this one is, check, we got that. And two, all of the premises have to be true. Okay, so that's important. So we've got validity, but are all the premises true? The second one I think is true. Ice cream's pretty popular, but is the first premise true? No, again, what were we saying about the last argument? Right? There's no connection between the popularity of ice cream and what the moon is made out of, at least as far as I know. So we have a false premise, right? The first premise is false. Therefore, it's not a sound argument. It's valid, it's just not sound. So it's not a good argument. Okay, let's try one more argument. Let's see if we can do better and get a better argument up here. So let's start from scratch. Let's look at this one. First premise. If Travis, that's me, if Travis can leap 2 inches from floor, then he can leap 1 inch from the floor. Second premise, Travis can leap 2 inches from floor. Therefore, we can conclude, anybody see where I'm going with this? He can leap 1 inch from the floor, and I'll be real lazy with this. Travis can leap 1 inch from the floor. Alright, so you can do that on your notes. Is this a valid argument? Yes, right? Same form as the last one. If A, then B, A, therefore B. Okay, is it sound? Yes, right? I just demonstrated that the second premise is true. And obviously the first one is true, right? If I can leap 2 inches, well, certainly I can also leap 1. I did it on the way to the 2, right? So here we have an argument that's both valid and sound. It's also an argument that doesn't tell us anything particularly interesting about the world, but it's a good argument nonetheless. So why'd I spend this time talking about arguments? Why do I spend so much time talking about validity and soundness? I mean, again, this isn't a course in logic, and I'm not testing you on this stuff. It's not going to be on the first test. But it will be with us throughout the course, I think, really. Throughout the course, when we approach our readings, I want us to do it in a very critical way. If you don't get anything out of this course except for one thing, that's what I really want you to get, is the ability to think critically about what you're reading and about the material that you're examining. And in order to do this, you kind of have to know what the argument is, right? So when you go to your reading, you have to figure out, well, what the heck is the conclusion? what is the author trying to convince me of? What's their thesis, right? And what premises did they use to support it, right? Once you figure that out, and I tell you it won't be that easy sometimes to figure that out. Once you figure that out, you want to look for validity and soundness. You want to know, well, hey, I know what they're trying to convince me of. I know how they're trying to do it, but does it really work, right? Does that conclusion really follow from what's been said in the premises, right? Is it valid? And sometimes you might think it is valid, but you just don't agree with some of the premises. You might say, well, that's true. If this were true, that would follow, but I don't agree with that premise. There's a false premise. So again, thinking critically, right? That's the main thing I think you're going to get out of this class, if you get anything. You know, if 10 months down the road, you know, you forget about Plato's theory of forms and you're not able to tell me about Aristotle's definition of happiness, I'm not going to lose sleep at night. I won't start crying, okay? But I want you to at least, again, be able to sort of step outside the box and think critically about the material that you're engaged in, right? And I think this is going to help you in all of your studies, not just in philosophy. And this is, I think, one thing that philosophy has overall of all the other disciplines, is that it's the only discipline, philosophy is, that forces you to do this. It forces you to think critically. It's not that science, you know, that scientists don't think critically. Certainly most of them, or some of them do, but you don't have to. I could get a degree in biology without questioning anything that I learned, without questioning the basis of the things that I learned. And I just take it at face value and do my science and do my experiments. That's not what we do here. In philosophy, I encourage you to question the material, to question the claims that are being put forth to you, right? Because to me, if philosophy is anything, it is that, right? It involves questioning. So let's go ahead and get started. I don't know how far we're going to get, but let's get started. I have a question here in the front. Yes?